be aware of the fact that you are here on time, so we're going to honor that. Thank you. And to allow her more time to present. So this is Soya Young.
Hi.
And Soya is a senior partner at Change Lab, which is a bi-coastal organization operating out of Seattle, New York right now, right?
That's right.
Okay. It's a grassroots political lab that explores structural solutions to achieve racial justice. They do research, they convene people across sectors, develop movement building tools, and provide platforms for dialogue, analysis, and strategy building. Soya herself has been in this movement as far as movement toward, I would say, equity and inclusion for at least 20 years. She, during the 90s, and it seems the 90s seems pretty long ago, right? And when you said during the 90s, it makes you feel
When she was a baby.
Really. I didn't want to say that, but she was working as a reporter at the International Examiner. She also worked for the Washington State House Democratic Caucus, and she's the founding executive director of the Washington Alliance for Immigrant and Refugee Justice. So pretty busy during the 90s. All right. She's also the founding chair of the Asian and Pacific Islander Coalition, which was formed in 1996 to restore food and cash assistance for low-income immigrants and refugees in Washington State. In the last 10, 15 years, she was the director of grant making at the Social Justice Fund. She's worked in other organizations around the Northwest, including Western State Center, the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, Nonprofit Assistance Center, working at the City of Seattle, and Washington State Budget and Policy Center. When she has time to volunteer, and I don't know how she finds time to volunteer, she serves on the steering committee of, help me out,
Sangnoksu.
Sangnoksu, a local organization of progressive Korean Americans, and on the executive committee of Grassroots International. Now at Change Lab, she has been working on Asian Americans in the racial justice movement. You can see there's some materials there, 2 studies that were put out by Change Lab. And she has conducted dozens of racial justice interviews with activists and leaders in 2011. And if you can't get a copy of, or if you want to share the information, we can tell you how to get that information to share with colleagues and friends. Did I miss anything?
No, that was very thorough. Thank you, Paula.
You're very welcome. And it's really an honor to have her join us.
Oh, thank you so much. I want to thank Paula and the county for asking me to come and present. And yeah, I didn't realize that my resume would be sort of read in that way. But it's great to see all of you here. Thanks for taking time out of your lunch hour. Maybe we can just quickly say name and department. We'll go around the room. Would you mind starting? Yeah, there was no fair warning.
Identified yourselves, we don't need to see.
That part will be cut out. Thank you all for coming again. So I'm going to go through this presentation, and then we'll have some time for a question and answer at the end. And if someone could maybe give me a signal when I'm at maybe 45 minutes, that would be great. Thanks. Okay. So I'm going to talk about some research that Change Lab did, and I'll tell you about who we are as well over the last couple of years about Asian Americans and racial justice. So first, just a little context. Can everyone see the screen? Okay, so what's going on right now with race? That's actually a cover photo in Time magazine of President Obama, and half his face is white and half his face is black. And it says, "Why the economy is trumping race." So some of you may have heard this term, post-racial, that sort of became very popular after the election of President Obama in 2008. The question of, are we post-racial? Does race matter anymore in the United States? So one of the things that we talk about in terms of the current conditions around race and issues of racial justice in the United States right now is demographics. So many of you probably know, working for government, that there are massive demographic changes afoot. Lots of folks are talking about by 2042, the United States nationally will no longer be a majority white nation. And what does that mean for issues of race and racial identity? So many folks are talking about that as an opportunity, and because as more folks of color become, as people of color in general, the majority of the nation, that there might be more opportunities to move a racial justice agenda. So colorblind racism, this is, again, having to do with the post-racial question, does race really matter? There's also a kind of emptying out from public discourse of issues of race. So people no longer really talk explicitly about race, while at the same time, racial disparities and structural racism persists. Asian uplift. So there are certain types of tropes within mainstream media, within public discourse about this idea of Asian uplift. Some of you might have seen the Pew Institute's report called The Rise of Asian Americans. This goes back to sort of during the 60s and 70s, the construction of the model minority myth, this idea that Asian Americans can somehow transcend race by working hard and succeeding. Oh, that last piece was the three-sided struggle. That's another important piece that we at ChangeLab talk about. So oftentimes when we're talking about racial justice struggles, we're seeing it as a struggle between communities on the ground and the state, that communities are making certain demands on the state to move certain policies. There's also another movement at work. There's a movement that's working for racial justice, that's sort of lifting up the critical fights on the ground. There's also another movement at work on the right, on the political right. As many of you know, the growth of the Tea Parties, those kinds of movements are also actively at work. So we see this as a three-sided struggle, that it's not just between communities of color in the state, but it's also, we also have to be mindful of what this other right-wing movement is doing. So there is President Obama. And moving on. So ChangeLab is focused on Asian Americans and race. We started a couple of years ago by talking with folks in the racial justice movement, about 12 people who we really respect and had worked with in the past, and who were sort of influential in racial justice work nationally, about what we should do, what we should focus on that would be strategic. We are an LLC. We're not a nonprofit organization, which is pretty unusual. And my partner, Scott Nakagawa, and I faced this really unique opportunity of finding an investor who is willing to invest in an LLC but be a silent partner. So that person has no real control over what we do or how we do our work, and we don't know how long that's going to last, but it's a very unique opportunity, and so we feel like we need to make the most of it. So we did these interviews with folks around the country, and what we heard was, as these demographic changes are happening, there's a way to look at that positively. There's also a way to see that that there might be shifts in terms of racial identity and racial allegiances that happen between now and 2042. And in some ways, Asian Americans, because of the way that we've been racialized as a model minority, you know, there may be ways, again, the title of the report, Left or Right of the Color Line, will we sort of side with the interests of folks of color, or will we side with the interests of white people? And so that's what we heard from racial justice leaders, is that nobody's really digging into that question, and how is that playing out? So we decided to focus on that. Correcting the storyline. So we feel like there's a lot of kind of mythology out there about race and America, and so we feel like our position, especially because we have the freedom to not be bound by foundation demands or other kinds of constraints, to sort of say things and lift up different things that other people might not be able to. Exploring white supremacy. So we think about white supremacy not as a form of extreme racial hatred, but really as sort of an ideology, which I'll explain later on in the presentation, that has sort of structured, when we talk about structural racism, really structured the kinds of relationships that we have with each other in the United States. A place to be bold. Again, we have a lot of freedom and flexibility that nonprofit organizations don't have. So we've been pulling together people who are involved in racial justice work around the country to have conversations about what can we do at ChangeLab that will be helpful to you all in your work, things that you can't maybe do yourselves. A grassroots laboratory. So we started by doing 87 in-depth confidential interviews with mostly Asian American leaders around the country. Some of those folks were involved in specifically racial justice organizations. Some of them were leaders of service providing types of organizations or civil rights types of organizations. But we really wanted to hear from the field about how Asian American identity was playing out currently, what might be coming down the pike in terms of trends, and what the implications were for work on the ground. Grounded in experience. So Scott and I both have a few decades in the progressive movement, and really one of the reasons why we formed Change Lab was from our experience of seeing the constraints within the nonprofit sector and things that we couldn't actually do, right? We're beholden to foundations, we're often beholden to the 501c3 tax code and things that we can and can't say. So because of that, we wanted to test out this new kind of structure and see what would be possible through that. So the problem of the color line. Our first report, based on the interviews that we did, was called Left or Right of the Color Line. And it summarizes a lot of the really pretty provocative things that we heard from our interviews. And so I'll be talking about that a little bit later on, exactly what those findings were. But there's a copy of that report, one copy left here. But you can also get it from our website, which is, if those of you picked up a copy, I think it's on the back of that report. It's www.changelabinfo.com. So the problem of the color line. So what is the color line? And what is race? These are questions that we rarely have the time or opportunity to talk about. And so it's kind of what I'll be talking about today. And going to begin with history, because we live in racial history. That's a quote from Howard Winant and Michael Omi, who wrote a seminal book on race called Racial Formation in, I think, 1984, in the 80s. And they really talk about sort of how current conditions are constructed by the past, right? We didn't just get here from nowhere. You know, there was sort of a sequence of events that led us to this particular moment. They also have there's a new book called Racial Formation in the 21st Century, which is kind of an upgrade of that, talking about how race has changed since the time that that book initially came out. The road to racial confusion. So, you know, one of our main findings was that this is a very confusing time for folks, that because we have so few opportunities to talk about race, we don't have a common understanding of what race is. And one of the things that makes it confusing is this idea of American empire, right? That we often commonly think of the United States as a land of freedom, democracy, a beacon of hope in the world. And you know, depending on where you begin the story of America, that story of the American dream is maybe more or less true, right? So if you begin the story from the time of you know, Europeans first coming to what is now the United States, you can see a pattern of not just slavery, but genocide and imperialism, a kind of exploitation of resources in the Americas, including the Caribbean and Latin America. So we think that that this has caused a kind of confusion, that because we don't begin there and tell an accurate story of history, that we oftentimes fall into these kind of mythologies about what the United States is. Liberal is good, right? So we often think about liberalism as a good thing. Since the end of World War II and since the Civil Rights Movement, freedoms, rights, democracy, those kinds of ideas have become very matter of fact in our public discourse about the United States. And it's not that that's a bad thing, but again, if we take a closer look at history and sort of how we got to this point, there's a way that that kind of rhetoric about freedom and democracy is actually used to propagate certain kinds of policies, foreign policies in the world, that because the United States has this kind of liberal national identity, it has not just the right, but an obligation to police the rest of the world, right? And to sort of defend democracy in various ways. The Southern Strategy. Does anyone know what the Southern Strategy is? Okay. Well, the Southern... actually, the Southern Strategy was... so the U.S. South actually used to be primarily Democratic. And that flipped to being primarily Republican. And so the Southern Strategy is kind of how that happened. So conservatives very intentionally built a coalition of people, of white evangelicals, of working class and poor whites in the South, sort of drumming up resentment against the rights of black people, the rights of women, the rights of gays and lesbians, to sort of make them the target of a lot of white working class and poor sort of political anxieties. So I'm going to show you a, let's see if this is going to work. Okay, that's not going to work. There's actually a, let's see. Oops, sorry about that. There's actually a video clip, if you want to look for it online on YouTube, by The Nation magazine of Lee Atwater talking about the Southern strategy. He was a political consultant during the Reagan era, and it's quite revealing. He is no longer alive, but the language that he uses is very revealing about kind of how the Republicans came up with very coded language around economic policies. So, for example, rather than using explicitly racist language, they used language like, cutting back state government, or different kinds of economic policies that actually, in the end, hurt black communities and communities of color more so than white people, but they weren't using explicitly racist language. So the importance of Asian Americans, it's not what you think. That's the title of our second report. This image was in the Wall Street Journal recently, last year. But this kind of trope in the media is quite common, right? You see Asian Americans taking the citizenship oath. It says, "Rise of the Tiger Nation. Asian Americans are now the country's best educated, highest earning, and fastest growing racial group. They share with American Jews both the distinction and the occasional burden of immigrant success." So that's one sort of media trope that you see. This is a photograph from 1942. It's a Japanese-American-owned grocery that closed. It was around the time of Japanese internment. And the sign says, "I am an American." So again, we think that when you dig deeper into some of these images of Asian American uplift and success, sometimes you see things like this where you realize that asserting American identity is really an act of self-defense, right? So you see that also post 9/11 with mosques flying the US flag. There certainly is a way that Asian Americans, like all peoples, embrace and buy into the American dream and that language. But there's also a way in which people are coerced, right, into asserting really strong support for American identity. So left or right of the color line, Asian Americans and the racial justice movement, this was our main research project over the last couple of years. And again, we interviewed 87 people. We used 57 of those interviews to actually analyze and include in the report, just because we wanted to balance by geography and certain other factors. So 5 of those 87 interviews were with African Americans, and that was actually not intentional, but we wanted to talk to folks in the racial justice movement who were doing cross-cutting work, across racial lines with various communities of color, and they happened to be African American. So we're intentionally talking about Asian Americans. We initially started this project thinking that we would also speak with Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. It became really clear to us very quickly that within that term API, Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians get routinely marginalized, right? Their issues are very different, and including them in this coalition term or acronym of API was sometimes disingenuous. So this is a quote from one of our interviewees who said, when we talk about API, people say, "Oh, we provide services for APIs, but the majority of people we service are Asian. Everyone always says APIs, but nobody is really focusing on the PIs." And that was a common sort of thread in our interviews. So we decided to actually be explicit about the fact that we're talking about Asian American identity in these, when we share these findings.
So are you saying you're excluding the PIs?
We did not include PI. We did not actively include PI interviewees in this project. And we think that we have plans and hopes to do a project specifically on Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders with those communities because we think that a research project should really center that experience. Thank you. Yeah, and I think it also depends on geography, right? Like here in Washington State, I think there has been some powerful coalition work between Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans. But for the purpose of this project, we really felt like, since we were looking nationally, that we wanted to specifically, be clear about the fact that we're talking about Asian Americans. So this is a time of great racial confusion with divergent views of what racial justice means. This was basically our main finding from these interviews. And we asked people questions about Asian American identity, how Asian Americans thought of themselves racially, how Asian Americans thought of other communities of color, what kinds of challenges and opportunities this created, and how people were dealing with that. So this is a quote from a leader of a national racial justice organization. I don't know if everyone can see that. So very influential, leading organization. This person said, they have a 24-person team, and half of the people within the organization would say, oh, the American dream, that's the best way, the perfect way to frame racial justice issues. And the other half would say, why would you use such a regressive kind of frame for racial justice issues? So there's a big difference in opinion. This is a political cartoon of President Obama breaking down what we mean by American exceptionalism. We side with freedom in the Mideast, and there's a whole bunch of exceptions. The idea of American exceptionalism, that America is somehow uniquely positioned to defend and assert freedom, equality, these kinds of values around the world, this came up as a theme quite often. This is another example of how confusing this time is. This is an organizer who asked the question, what's the goal of our organizing? Is it just to have a seat at the table, so there's an Asian mayor or something? Or is it that we are actually part of a larger movement that's calling for transformation structurally? So this tension between representation and actually structural transformation was a big topic that came up. So that's one of our main findings. Another one is many people said that many Asian Americans actually don't think about race. And this quote kind of sums it up. I think many don't think about it at all or think of themselves as exceptions to the American racial arrangement. And then there were a lot of sort of theories about why this was true, that it's not just something inherent to Asian Americans, but there are structural reasons behind it. So this person talked about the class makeup of the Asian American population and how it's shifted pretty dramatically. We were talking about this in the elevator, post-1965, that there are actual structural reasons for why the people who are in the United States are in the United States, right? This is another quote, again saying, I think a lot of second-generation folks kind of see us as being brand new or see our experiences as not really connected to how other people of color are treated in this country. They just don't have the historical reference for it. So that's another sort of structural reason that you don't learn about race and racial history in public education, not in the ways that would lend themselves to some sense of solidarity or connection. This person talked about, a lot of people said it's absolutely true that Asian Americans experience racism, experience racial discrimination, but oftentimes they just don't have the language for it, or they think it has to do with somehow their immigration status or their religious status, but they don't necessarily think about it as an issue of race. This is an image that, have any of you seen this image before? Those Asian American whiz kids. So this again is an example of how the model minority was constructed in the media, kind of lifting up Asian Americans as a model minority. And of course, implicit in that is that there are problem minorities. And the very first time that actually came out was in the 60s in a news article about Japanese Americans. It was around the time that the Black Power movement was taking off, and a lot of militant and radical movements for racial justice were happening, including Asian American movements. So again, it doesn't take a lot of guesswork to figure out, okay, if Asian Americans are the model minority at a time when there's great upheaval, particularly around Black liberation, who's the problem minority? It was also around that time that the war on crime and the war on drugs, that whole trajectory took off under Nixon. So I think it's important for us to ask ourselves, not just looking at the fact that this model minority myth exists, but really asking, why does it exist? What purpose does it serve? Where did it come from? Who does it help? Who does it hurt? Those are the kinds of questions that I think we in the racial justice movement need to really dig into. Another finding was that Asian Americans have internalized a sense of superiority over other people of color. Again, this is very provocative stuff. These were confidential interviews, but with some of the really leading voices within Asian American spaces and racial justice spaces, and this was a very prominent theme. This was actually particularly pronounced when it came to relations between Asian Americans and African Americans. So this is a quote from one of our African American informants who talked about the kind of perception within the Black community of Asian American hostility. This is a South Asian professor, scholar, who talked about kind of the rational reasons why this happens, right? So Asian immigrants often come to the United States. It doesn't take long to sort of pick up on the racial dynamics and racial hierarchy in the United States. And so, why would Asian immigrants choose to identify with African Americans, right? This is an organizer who works with Asian American communities and talked about how sometimes it's based on real life experiences, like experiences of hostility from Black people within, like riding the bus, for example. But she also says that even when there's not that basis of experience, that people have this idea in their minds about Black criminality or bad behavior, right, that comes from somewhere else other than lived experience. This issue of colonialism came up a lot. So the question again of why are Asian Americans here in the United States, and sort of the roots of migration and the roots of European, particularly colonization in Asia. This is a South Asian interviewee who talked about how within those experiences with colonization, the racial hierarchy was replicated and propagated within those spaces in the countries of origin. So that there's a historical reason why people have internalized these ideas. Asian American is less a political identity than a demographic category. So, when the term Asian American came about in the 60s, it came about to unify as a kind of coalition Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, because prior to that, we would only identify ourselves by ethnic group. And also, we were, there were lots of ugly racial slurs used against us, gook, chink, all these really horrible, this horrible language. So Asian American as an identity was created as an alternative to all of that, to really assert ourselves as a coalition of people who were, who shared some political values, right? Since then, it's changed a lot. Obviously, the Asian American community has diversified incredibly. There's a lot of linguistic diversity, cultural diversity, and a lot of emphasis on demographics, right? On data disaggregation, not enough emphasis, but there is this kind of focus on Asian American identity as a descriptor of a group of people, not as a descriptor of a certain kind of politics. So this is a really pretty cynical quote from a very well-known professor of Asian American studies who said that, Asian American identity is constructed in a college setting, that if you've gone to college, taken Asian American studies courses, you have some shared experience. But that is qualitatively different from, and experientially different from somebody who's a migrant worker, or somebody who recently immigrated and is, for example, a Vietnamese fisher person or a Punjabi taxi driver, that there's no unity. So this person also said, my choice to identify as API was to sort of assert a shared politics and assert a solidarity with other Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, but that he believes that term API actually renders invisible, as you were saying, certain kinds of experiences, and kind of presumes that there's this commonality when there really isn't, always. So there was a lot of quotes about how it really depends. It depends on geography, it depends on ethnic group. This question of does Asian American identity make sense as a political identity, as a racial identity, a lot of the responses were, well, it depends. It depends where you are. It depends what group you're talking about. So that came up a lot. Again, do we really share common experiences, common histories, and common concerns? This is another, this person sort of harkens back to the origins of the Asian American movement and says, I think we lost something since then.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
When you, of the people that you've interviewed, because you said that you interviewed Asian American leaders,
Mm-hmm.
were any of these young people?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think in there's an age breakdown. But yeah, we did interview, I don't know what you mean by young. Not like 18, but 20s and 30s.
There were a few of 20, or were the majority? I'm just trying to.
Yeah,
trying to
the
understand.
demographic breakdown is in the back of the report. I don't remember off the top of my head what the exact numbers were, but we did strive for age diversity, or at least generational diversity.
Okay, I was just
Yeah.
curious, because sometimes
In the United
the
States.
United States.
So West Coast, East Coast, Midwest, South.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, this person was talking about that historical break, that there's no continuity between the days of the original Asian American movement and today, that in Arizona, there's this big fight to preserve ethnic studies without people being conscious of where ethnic studies even came from, right? That was a critical part of the Asian American movement, was to connect ethnic studies in campuses, in college campuses, with actual communities, grassroots communities, so that there was a real connection there between students and communities that were in struggle, but that has been kind of lost. And that's a picture of the International Hotel in San Francisco, which was a site of a big community struggle over low-income housing and against gentrification. Asian American, so again, Asian American people felt like is really more of a demographic descriptor than a political identity. Strengthening Asian American identity would be strategic only if it were anti-racist. So there was a sense that, when we asked people, does it make sense to really organize around API identity? Should we strengthen that identity? There were a lot of confused responses, but people said, it might be more important and interesting to complicate the identity because there is a shared identity, it just might not be very progressive. So there are a lot of questions about whether this would be useful or not. And then there's also this reality that if you're working in the DC Beltway or if you're working in legislative politics, that oftentimes if you're not unified as APIs, people see that as a requisite for actually having and exerting political power, right? So this is another quote about how Asian Americans don't necessarily identify with other communities of color racially. And this person argues that it's actually not so much the honorary white status that people often talk about when they talk about Asian Americans, but it's more a distancing from blackness. So this is another quote, sort of, I'm going to skip around just in the interest of time. So this is actually a really great quote from a longtime sort of cultural organizer saying, I think there's a lot of ways where tough questions are simply being evaded in order to find some basis of unity. I just do not think those are racial justice spaces, or if they are, then I think someone like Bobby Jindal, anyone know who Bobby Jindal is?
Yes.
Governor of Louisiana. And a Republican, yes. Has every right to claim that he's doing racial justice work. I don't quite get the line that says, well, he's not, but when we're fighting to keep Lowell open to Asian Americans, that's somehow okay. Or we are saying, we're the new minority in town, so look at us now. So it's kind of a powerful quote about saying, just because we all find ourselves in this category of API, it doesn't mean that we're on the same side when it comes to racial justice fights. A lot of comments talked about you know, that, again, it depends, right? It depends on where you live. It depends on what your racial experiences are in your community, in your workplace, et cetera. So there's a sort of range of consciousness. And that really our task in the racial justice movement is to figure out how to move folks along that spectrum to deepen their analysis. So this person is South Asian, talked about the need for cross-racial coalitions. So basically, there are a few people who said this, that the time for identity politics to really be important has kind of passed, that instead we need to be organizing strategically across racial identity. So during the 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe even into the 80s, there was a time when it was important to really organize ourselves around, as Asian Americans or as African Americans. This is kind of the thrust behind these kinds of quotes. But now, because of what's happening with the economy, because of what's happening around immigration, that we really have to build across those lines. So for Asians in general to be aware of how they're racialized is important, so that hopefully we don't get played as bad as we are right now against ourselves and other groups. That kind of sums it up. So the other finding was that interracial solidarity, if that's really what we need, demands deep political education. So in order to do that consciousness building and analysis building with communities, grassroots communities on the ground, everyday folk, that we actually have to come up with tools and vehicles to have these conversations with people on the ground about how they're experiencing race, what the history of race is in the United States, just to sort of build that consciousness. This is from an organizer talking about one of their Asian American members around immigration issues who had this view that undocumented immigrants, mostly Latinos, were somehow cheating the system. They were jumping ahead of the line and it was unfair. And then they took a trip actually to Mexico to look at the conditions within Mexico and look at the root causes of that, the way that the economy has changed in terms of its structure, the impact of free trade agreements on the economy there, and kind of the root causes for why people cross the border and seek work in the United States. And that person actually shifted their view. So it was an example of the importance and role of that kind of education.
Okay, when you say shifted their view, from what to what?
From having that anti-immigrant, that hostility against undocumented Mexicans primarily, to really seeing a basis for solidarity.
Already?
Yeah, I think that maybe when we get to the end, we can talk about some of those questions and unpack that a little bit, because I think there's some examples of ways that people are dealing with that we can talk about. Yeah. So this is another person who talked about the effects of certain countries where people were refugees from wars, for example, in Southeast Asia or in Korea, not so much refugees, but had experiences of US wars there, and this kind of very strong anti-communist view, and not just anti-communist, but fear of speaking out, fear of actually protesting, because they experience very real government repression for doing that, right? So that it's sometimes very difficult to have conversations about people where you're questioning things. So interracial solidarity demands deep political education. This is a photo from, I think, late 1960s, an example of kind of the interracial solidarity that did exist, particularly in California, between the Asian American movement and the Black Liberation movement at that time.
There were actually Asians in the Black Panther movement, and I think they did a documentary on an Asian gentleman.
Richard Aoki.
Yeah.
Yes.
I haven't seen it yet, but I really want to see it.
Yes, even here in Seattle, there were Asian Americans in the Black Panther Party. So why being Asian American matters? You know, if you sort of read the news and absorb some of those messages, you might think it's because, oh, Asian Americans are the model of kind of working really hard and the immigrant success story. But actually, we think Asian Americans matter, that identity matters, and is actually very important, because at its origins was very much based in interracial solidarity and anti-imperialism. So critiquing the Vietnam War, critiquing sort of the structural basis for racial disparities in the 60s and 70s. So what we're up against. Orientalism and Asian utility. So this is another quote by Michael Omi and Dana Takagi, basically talking about, unlike black and white, Asian Americans, there's a sort of fluidity to Asian American identity, and it gets used by both the left and the right, the political left and the right, and it often doesn't even matter if it's true, right? So there's a kind of way that Asian Americans we're not in control of the conversation or with how we get portrayed or kind of deployed for political purposes. And that really sort of has a history in Orientalism. Orientalism is kind of the us versus them kind of thinking that justifies war and certain kinds of national foreign policy issues. And Orientalism is really rooted in European imperialism, right? Sort of the days of European conquest, and you can see that in the cartoon there. That China in particular, but parts of Asia were cast as this kind of exotic, foreign, sometimes threatening, sometimes exotic in a positive way, but always other, right? So colorblind racism, the silencing of race. This is from one of the organizers we talked to who said, for white consumers, launching a campaign around stolen tips is easier than around racial segregation. White people either feel uncomfortable talking about race or don't believe or understand that this kind of thing exists. So that's a primary challenge. Out of sight, out of mind. Another finding of ours was that oftentimes Asian American struggles, the communities that are actually most directly experiencing poverty, workplace discrimination, immigration issues, deportation, detention, that those communities are oftentimes very invisible. That people don't even think about them within racial justice spaces often. And that Asians in big cities, as this person says, working class, migrant, particularly first generation migrants and their families, are totally lost in their survival world, which many people assume is entirely blacks and Latinos. For those communities, a huge issue is how to survive in cities that are being destroyed. Many of those communities are completely invisible. So that photo, actually, again, it's another example of kind of asserting Americanhood, right? This is from a movement called One Love Movement, which started in Philadelphia, of primarily Khmer people who are facing deportation back to Cambodia. There is this kind of yearning to be greater than the sum of our parts, right? So it's not just a question of being included in racial justice work. It's this notion that Asian Americans actually have a critical and strategic contribution to make because of our experiences, right? With war, with displacement. So this is an organizer who works in the Chinese American community with low-income folks, and sort of talking about how difficult it is, how challenging it is to say, we're experiencing these issues and we think it should be part of this racial justice agenda, that there's a kind of invisibility of Asian American racial justice struggles. This person, longtime organizer, Filipino organizer, who said that he cut his teeth actually organizing in black communities in the 80s, I believe, and in other communities as well, but outside of his own Filipino community, and talks about the contribution that Asian communities have to make, not just in building a racial justice movement, but a global justice movement that really centers race, right? He goes on, actually the same person goes on to talk about the way that immigrant rights issues are framed is oftentimes really kind of problematic because it doesn't take into account what's happening in countries of origin, right? So it's like only fighting for rights of people who are in the United States without understanding that there's a whole struggle in other parts of the world that are actually connected to the conditions that drive people to migrate to the United States. Under attack. Asian American communities are under attack, specifically South Asian, Arab, and Muslim communities, certain other communities, Cambodian, other Southeast Asian communities. Because of where foreign policy is at, there's a threat of physical violence, deportation, a change in foreign policy is key, decriminalization of undocumented people. These are some of the key issues, according to that person. This is a story, I won't read the quote, but a story of one of our interviewees whose little brother was sent to prison for sending photos over the internet. He was a teenage, a young person. So, okay, I'm going to keep moving on. So this is another thing we're up against, is that we're not really up to speed in terms of analysis. So we often, because of foundation constraints, because of the kinds of limitations of the nonprofit sector, that we often don't get into a room together to really think about what is it we should be doing, what's going on right now, where can we intervene, what would be strategic to do. So we actually convened a national strategy meeting a couple of weeks ago with about 20 folks from around the country and had that kind of conversation. It was incredibly rich, very, very useful. The importance of a gender analysis. Sorry, I'm trying to speed up. This is another sort of chickens coming home to roost sort of argument about South Asians who are experiencing targeting and discrimination now that oftentimes actually was from other people of color, and including African Americans and Puerto Ricans. But the question was sort of, we have to ask ourselves, well, where were we all these years in moments of what should have been solidarity? We were often playing into oppression, if not directly oppressing those same communities. Just that point of we have to be there for each other, if we want to really have each other's backs over the long term. Infrastructure, not up to scale. So this is another challenge that we face, is that organizations really aren't getting funded at the level and don't have the kind of capacity that they need to engage in that deep political education work and the kinds of organizing that we think is necessary. There's this one person who talked about a leader from Burma who's amazing, really gets it, but he's been tortured, imprisoned. They're so caught up in this sort of survival mode that we can't really get him to be part of larger racial justice fights. And the social service agencies that he is turning to for help with his communities are actually super reluctant, if not outright resistant, to addressing racial justice. So those are some of the challenges. And so contesting white supremacy, we think, requires new thinking, new language, stronger organizing, and real solidarity. And some of the ways we think that can happen is understanding how white supremacy works. Again, not as an extreme form of hatred, but as a kind of set of ideas that drive the structures in this country. So we think of it as sort of a trifecta, right? There's the logic of slavery, which is very much tied to the economy. So if we had a longer time, we could talk about how slavery was involved in constructing the US economy. And the logic of genocide, which again was also part of constructing the US economy, that Native Americans constantly have to be disappeared, and that to make way for US settlerism, right? And then the third logic is Orientalism, which I talked about before, this kind of us versus them thing that doesn't just impact Asian Americans, but really sort of had its genesis in Asia. So how those three things work together, and Orientalism being the logic that justifies war. The racial bribe. So within each one of these, and we can see this in some of the findings, that there's a bribe, right, that we as people of color constantly face. That it's not just that we're being oppressed, we're also participating in these systems. And so to be really conscious of that and how we respond. Setting and policing norms. So this is kind of how white supremacy gets its traction, again, from the norm of thinking about the American dream, or the norm of what a family should look like, those kinds of things, and then who gets policed around those kinds of norms. Rights and enforcement, two sides of the same coin. So a lot of people talked about, when you're struggling for rights, oftentimes you're reaching for these levers of power that, again, are making you complicit in some of these other oppressive systems. So to really think about when we're fighting for rights in certain campaigns, the other side of it, which the flip side of rights is enforcement and policing. So in thinking about when we're arguing for rights, are we actually throwing other people under the bus, right? So white supremacy, three interconnected forms of racist logic. These values advance through right-wing Christian ideas of family and nation, impose and maintain the social hierarchies that allow white supremacy to endure. So that's actually from our report, but it's really taken from the scholarship of Andrea Smith, who's a Native American scholar who's written extensively about white supremacy, and we've learned a lot from her. So understanding the current political moment. This is a sign that really shows you kind of the Southern strategy, right? How these coalitions were built. It says, Ohio Christians against baby murdering Muslims for president. So, it sounds kind of, we can chuckle at it, but this does reveal the kind of coalition that the right has built around these ideas. The present is a construction of the past. Race is permanent, but it changes. The right builds strategic coalitions, and so should we. So we oftentimes, again, think about race as a descriptor of certain groups of people, when actually it's a political idea and a set of relationships that we're participating in. So I think in that way, it is permanent, even though those dynamics shift over time. Organize people of color within and across lines of structural advantage. I think that's self-explanatory. Change culture. There's this notion that because of the constraints of the nonprofit sector, we don't get to actually impact culture. So the media, music, arts, even religious institutions, that we need to build that stream of consciousness. We need to reclaim and rebuild Asian American anti-racist politics, that there's a historical basis for that, and we should just reclaim that and strengthen that. Have difficult conversations. There's a way that oftentimes we're pushed or pressured into finding the areas of agreement when really we have to have those difficult conversations about where we don't agree. Develop new tools, political education tools. Be able to try things and fail. So there's a sense that in nonprofit organizations, oftentimes they can't afford to fail because they have to report to a funder or they have to constantly be talking about their successes. So we really need to have the space and the freedom to try new things. So left or right of the color line. At the beginning, we asked, what is the color line? A lot of times people quote W.E.B. Du Bois in his book, The Souls of Black Folk in 1903. He said, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And usually the quote just stops there. But actually, the rest of the quote is the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America and the islands of the sea. It was a phase of this problem that caused the Civil War. So there was actually this consciousness that the color line was not just only a black and white color line within the United States, but that it was actually part of a global phenomenon. And 50 years later, actually Du Bois, shifted to really truly being more of an internationalist in his politics. So this is the racial bribes piece of it that Andy Smith talks about. All non-native peoples are promised the ability to join in the project of settling indigenous lands. All non-black people are promised that if they comply, they will not be at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. And black and native peoples are promised that they will advance economically and politically if they join US wars to spread, quote unquote, democracy. And so I'm gonna end with this image of Dr. King and President Obama, again, not because of their similarities, but to kind of lift up their differences. My favorite speech by Dr. King was a Beyond Vietnam speech in 1967. And he actually takes a very, very strong stand against the Vietnam War, against the advice of folks around him. And he says some really powerful things. If you haven't listened to the speech, I think you can listen to it online. It's really, really worth it. It's, he basically talks about how people within his circles questioned, why are you speaking out against the war? Peace and civil rights don't mix. This isn't your issue. You're actually hurting your people. And then he says, when I hear them, although I understand their concern, I'm greatly saddened. For such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling. Indeed, their questions suggest that they do not know the world in which they live. So if his calling is really around racial liberation, he understood that required taking a stand against the Vietnam War. And again, I think this is an example of the racial bribe at work, because he would then, the next day after the speech, lose massive support, basically get disinvited from the White House. I think about 160 newspapers, including the New York Times, wrote editorials against him and against that position. But, how did we get to that? And that was a year before he was assassinated, to the first black president in the United States launching secret drone attacks, actually kind of fulfilling this prophecy that Dr. King laid out about the United States becoming the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. So I think we have to question again, what is race? Is it just simply a matter of shared physical traits or attributes, or does it actually mean a shared kind of political agenda, right? So left or right of the color line, where will we stand? Those are the kinds of questions that we're grappling with at ChangeLab, and we don't have the answers, but we think we're trying to have some of the conversations that folks don't normally get to have about these issues. So I'll stop there. Thanks. Yeah. I don't know how much time we have, but yeah.
I think until we're ready to go. So I think right now people have to leave.
Yeah.
So let them leave, and then other folks who can stay longer
Sure.
engage you in a conversation.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have one. Earlier on, you said something about, in the 60s, that there was a reason why Asian Americans came to the United States at that time, or something like that.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
So, you know, before 65, the United States had kind of built into the structure of its immigration policies basically a policy of Asian exclusion. So there was sort of a stagnation of the population in terms of who was actually here. In 1965, the Immigration Naturalization Act passed, which actually ended that and opened the United States up to immigration from Asia based on family unification policies. That's actually, in the current immigration fight, something that we're facing is, in the current Senate bill, an end to family unification and more of a merit-based immigration policy, which is problematic. But post-65, a lot of the folks who came from Asia were folks who had a certain amount of privilege, right? Whereas prior to that, a lot of folks came as laborers, as indentured laborers, or as oftentimes single men who were coming for work. And then, of course, you also had refugees from Southeast Asia in the 70s and 80s. So the demographics of the Asian American population changed quite a bit after 1965, really after World War II. But, yeah.
So we talk a lot about, I think, inequities, and I'm sure you're aware of our equity and social justice ordinance here in Seattle's racial and social justice work that they do. And I think that when we talk about inequities, there are two things. I think one is a greater push towards looking at place-based inequities, and the second one is still continuing the kind of black-white lens on it. So what advice do you give, especially to young Asian American advocates, not necessarily that, I don't know that we're all in, we'll just pretend that we're all young Asian American advocates. What do you tell them about assuring that the Asian American either experience or voice is not forgotten in those conversations? Or do you?
Sonia, before you answer the question, I would say maybe also include those who are not that young Asian Americans
Yes.
as to what they, the stand that they should take in terms of how we advance.
Yeah. I think that we just need to have more conversations in our communities about how we experience race and also the history of Asian Americans and race in this country. So, I'm not actually in the position of giving advice to folks young or old in the Asian American community right now, but we are thinking at Change Lab a lot about what are the things that we need to be doing in partnership with organizations and communities to, first of all, develop a new language and vocabulary to tie issues of race to issues of war and foreign policy and sort of why people are coming to the United States. Because that's very much a part of that dynamic, but we don't have the vocabulary for it. When we talk about race, we're mostly thinking about, the civil rights movement, which was critical, but the civil rights movement only took us so far. And there were actually very intense struggles after the civil rights legislation passed, because there was an acknowledgement that it didn't actually lead to full liberation, right? And those more militant movements were, criminalized and suppressed in a very serious way.
So I guess